Hey Lake Point, Pastor Michael here to get you caught up on the 8th week of our series, Faith That Works. It's a series where we're taking a look at the writings of Jesus' half-brother James. Why? Because we want a faith that is both practical and meaningful, a faith that actually works. And James provides us with a framework for just that. This week, what we're going to see from James is that we can have a faith that actually helps us reduce quarreling and bickering and fighting and arguing and all those other childish behaviors that we don't always leave behind when we become adults. In chapter 4, verses 1 to 10, James writes this. He says, "What is causing the quarrels and fights among you? Don't they come from the evil desires that war within you? You want what you don't have, and so you scheme and kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, and so you fight and you wage war to take it away from them. You don't have what you want because you don't ask God for it. And even when you ask, you don't get it because your motives are all wrong. You want only what will give you pleasure." James says, "You adulterers, don't you realize that friendship with the world makes you an enemy of God? I say it again, if you want to be a friend of the world, you make yourself an enemy of God." He says, "Do you think the scriptures have no meaning? They say that God is passionate, that the spirit he has placed within us should be faithful to him. And he gives us grace generously. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble." And so James says to humble yourselves before God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, for your loyalty is divided between God and the world. James says, "Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy." He says, humble yourself before the Lord, and he will lift you up in honor. Now, what you need to keep in mind is that James writes in a way that is very similar to the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament. He uses these short, challenging wisdom thoughts that are full of metaphors and easy to remember one-liners. And if you're feeling like there was a lot of hard-hitting truth packed into those verses, it's because there was. And so to kind of unpack what James wrote, Pastor Nathan began by considering the question of what causes quarrels, what causes fights. And as we just read in the writings of James, what we learned is that it's the evil desires within us that cause quarreling. James says that the quarrels begin with the selfish, conflicting desires that exist within us. Conflict doesn't begin out there, it begins in here. The biggest internal conflict we deal with is the war between our selfish desires and God's desires for our lives. Look at what the Apostle Paul says in Galatians chapter 5, verse 17. He says, "Our sinful desires want what is the opposite of God's Spirit, and God's Spirit wants what is contrary to our sinful desires. And so the two are constantly fighting each other, so you cannot just do whatever you please." That right there describes the biggest inner conflict that all of us deal with. We live in a culture that says, do whatever you please. But if you are a Christ follower, you have God's Spirit living in you, and he lovingly convicts you and says, no, you can't just do whatever your sinful desires please. I want you to love God and love people wholeheartedly, and that's going to pose a conflict to what your flesh wants. James then describes how this inner conflict is manifested through our external behavior. He writes this in verse 2, "You want what you don't have, and so you scheme and you kill to get it. You are jealous of what others have, but you can't get it, and so you fight and wage war to take it away from them." James is saying that these evil desires which wage war within us, they lust after the pleasures of the flesh, pride, power, possessions, praise, and so we fight to get those things. Now, if that's the problem, the question is, how do we fix it? And that is the question that Nate sought out to address. And so how do we reduce quarreling in our homes and in our marriages, with our family members, with our neighbors and our coworkers, with people online or people in our life group, with people who disagree with us on masks or vaccines or politics or religion or any other matter of conviction? And so Pastor James and the Apostle Paul and the writers of Proverbs offer some very helpful insights. And so the first step in quarreling less is to realize how destructive quarreling is. All through scriptures, we see families who fight with each other, and it always ends up badly. This is why over and over again, God's commandments warn against quarreling. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 3, 2 Timothy 2, verse 24, Titus 3, 1-2, Proverbs 20, verse 3, and Proverbs 17, 14 are just a handful of the verses that warn against it. The second step is to decide you want to change and ask for forgiveness. You have to decide that you want to change, that you're sick and tired of your behavior, and that you want something better for your life, your relationships, your marriage, your home, and your heart. And so James says, wash your hands, you sinners, purify your hearts. Let there be sorrow and deep grief. Let there be sadness instead of laughter and gloom instead of joy. What is James saying there? He's saying that if you truly want to change, you need to stop laughing at your sin and get serious about it. That you need to repent, ask God to cleanse you, seek His forgiveness and His power in your life. The third thing that James says to do to stop quarreling is to stop expecting other people to fill needs in your life that really only God can fulfill. And this is one of the biggest causes of conflict and quarreling in relationships, especially in marriages. We expect our spouse to meet the needs in our lives that really only God can meet. And it sounds nice and it sounds romantic, but it's actually a great way to set up your marriage for failure. You're expecting your spouse to meet your emotional needs, your need for identity and self-esteem, value and worth, significance and security, joy and peace. And they can't do that because they're not God. James says you want to quarrel less, go to God with your needs and ask with the right motives. Don't ask for things that are rooted in selfish pleasure, but ask for things that are rooted in godliness. Which leads us to the fifth thing that Pastor James tells us to do, and he says, choose humility over pride. Why? Because as it says in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 10, pride only leads to arguments. God is at war with pride, ego, and arrogance. It's why if God is going to help you reduce conflict and quarreling in your life, it starts with humility. It's through humbling yourself and receiving God's help, His grace. What is grace? Grace is the power to change. If you want to stop quarreling and fighting, then you need grace. And the only way to experience grace is to be humble. All right. The sixth thing that James tells us we can do to reduce quarreling is to live our lives in a way that recognizes the source behind the hurtful words. Often we neglect to appreciate the unseen spiritual war going on behind the scenes. You may think that you're arguing about whose turn it is to take out the garbage or whether you did or did not say what someone thought you said. But beyond that surface level quarrel, there's a deeper work going on, and that's Satan. He is trying to wreak havoc in your marriage, in your home, in your relationships with your kids, in your relationship with your extended family, in your life group, in your church, in your work, in your community. And that's what he specializes in. He will use any opening he can find to do this in our lives. It's why James warns us to not give the devil a foothold. And finally, if you want to reduce quarreling, you need to silently talk to God. As Nate shared, the beautiful thing about being a human being is that our minds are sharp enough that we can carry on two conversations at the same time. You can be in a very intense conversation with someone where you're tempted to start quarreling, and in order to protect yourself from being angry and allowing the devil to get a foothold, what you can do is you can actually silently start praying to God, asking you to asking Him to help you remain calm and walk in humility and wisdom. James says, draw close to God and God will draw close to you. And this is what happens when you begin talking to God. The devil flees and God gives you the strength you need to remain calm and walk in peace rather than getting angry, defensive, or upset and saying something that you will regret. Well, friends, consider yourselves caught up. Enjoy working through the discussion questions and hopefully avoiding quarreling with your life group. We'll see you next time.